times.
Cool. All right. So, what I will say, preface this with, is originally this is based off my master's thesis work. And so a lot of my master's thesis was trying to convince academics that this is actually cool. So I'm going to try and invert some of that to make it applicable to us as a community. So just, there's a lot of theory here. Sorry in advance. So my hypothesis when I was writing my thesis was Larp organizations and governance styles can be analyzed with the same theoretical tools we use to examine the state or corporations or institutions that govern the rest of our lives. And so by analyzing our power structures, we can more consciously understand our own communities and build power structures that fall in line with our own values. So that's kind of how I'm inverting the original hypothesis to make it applicable to us, because I think that we should explore these things so we can consciously practice what we preach, I guess. So I use the theory of Michel Desserteau, the practice of everyday life, which I will get into here in a little bit, to analyze 3 Larp groups in Iowa playing in World of Darkness, Vampire, and Werewolf games in One World by Night. So for anyone that doesn't know what World of Darkness is, it's a horror Larp. You play supernatural or kind of supernatural adjacent creatures. And here specifically in these games, the games are contemporary, so they're playing in 2018. They're campaign style, and game time and physical time are congruent. So that means that if a year passes in the game, then a year passes in physical time as well. And the games that I studied had been running for 8, 15, and 20 years. So that's some of the background. I did participant observation and interviews over the summer of 2016. And there were 2 vampire LARPs, 1 werewolf LARP. I was a participant in the werewolf LARP, had a character, and the 2 vampire LARPs I didn't because they felt it would be unfair for me to have as much information as I did doing the study and still play a character in that kind of world. So that's the background for the study itself. And the key points for today are Desserteau, tactician and strategist, which is the theory that I'll be using, how I broke down power within my thesis, and then how that helps us understand the worlds that we are building. So Desserteau was really interested in this conflict between the tactician and the strategist. The tactician for him was the rule breaker, or the strategist is the rule maker. So for him, the tactician was very much people, like a person or a group of people, where the strategist could be a person, but doesn't have to be. So he described it. Oh, yeah, sorry. There. No, one more. I'm working on 2 computers. Sorry about that. So the strategist can be anything from a person that's making rules to, like, this chair was designed for me to sit in it in a certain way, a proper use for that chair, and so it has strategy to it. It's really weird. Hope it makes sense. But the idea here is that tacticians and strategists work together to create the world that we have today. So he described a city, and the way that he used the city was the buildings and the architecture, the sidewalks and the street are all strategy. So that is confining your behavior. You're supposed to walk on the sidewalk. You're supposed to cross the street with a crosswalk. If there is a restaurant that you want to go to that's directly across from you, but the light is down the street, technically you're supposed to go down the street and around, but no one does that. So they act tactically, and they walk directly across the street, doing improper action. So, on top of that, there are strategic actions and tactical actions. A strategic action is very conscious. It takes a lot of time. Like if you want to build a building in New York City, it's going to take several steps and probably several years to make that happen. That would be a strategical move. A tactician, so let's say I have this chair, I'm supposed to be sitting in it, that is the proper use for it, but someone's trying to break in the door and I take the chair and I shove it up against the door so it can't be opened. That's a tactical action. So that is improperly using the chair, but still useful in the world. So that is a tactical action. And essentially the way that Disserteau explains this is that we are all tacticians. We are born as tacticians. We have to experience the world to understand where the boundaries are. So we understand gravity by taking mom's keys and throwing them on the floor 20 times a day. And we also learn about behavior when mom finally yells at us for throwing those keys on the floor. That is how we learn to be in the world. And then you have strategy, which is the world itself, but you can also see that strategy by taking yourself above. So here he explains it by standing on top of the Empire State Building. You're looking out over the city, you can see the whole city and all of the patterns that exist within it, so even when you're down on the street, if it doesn't make sense, when you're up there, you can make sense of it. You can see what's happening. And that's actually why I really like to use this theory, because I think that if we can move our view to look strategically at the world, we can understand the power structures that are everywhere. Use those things to help improve ourselves and the imagined worlds that we are building. So, to get into how I broke this down. Essentially, I saw 4 different power levels within Larp governance. So, one of the things I didn't explain actually was organizations. So, One World by Night is an international organization.
Forward?
Sorry, every time. Yes, okay. Sorry, guys. I saw 4 different levels of power. The rules, which are the strategists. So when you're in a LARP, you get a rule book, at least within One World by Night, World of Darkness games. You get a book that has all the rules and mechanics that tell you how you're supposed to play, you know, rock, paper, scissors, and all that jazz, but also sets up what is a vampire, what kinds of vampires can I be, what does it actually mean to be these different kinds of vampires, and how is that society made up, how is it created, what does it mean to be a Giovanni, what does it mean to be a Tremere, and it changes the way that you're going to imagine who you are as a character, but also the imagined world around you. So that is why it's a strategist. It is confining your behavior. And the designers, therefore, also strategists because they're the ones making the rules. Organization, One World by Night, here is an international organization that essentially makes communities play. So they facilitate play between games in America, Canada, Brazil, one might still be in Israel, I'm not sure. And all of these games are connected into one world story, so that you can have a game, a player in Iowa who has a single character, they can take it to New York and play that same character in the same world on the same time. This also means that a game in Iowa could potentially impact the game in New York because of something that they do within the game. So the organization has a bunch of people that make it work. They have an executive board, they have regional administrators and coordinators for story, and so they are strategists because they have the ability to change the game. So for instance, the status packet was just put out a few months ago, which just said the old rules of status don't mean anything, here's the new rules for this thing. So they're able to change the game. And they also do things like create rules for behavior, codes of conduct, things like that, that take a lot of time and a lot of conscious effort to create, and are so then are therefore strategic action. I will say Disserteau sees strategy and tacticians as very separate categories. They don't intermingle or mix a lot. It's not how life actually works. It's much more messy. So even though I'm explaining the rules and the designers and the organization as strategists, that doesn't mean they can't act tactically. It just means that makes the most sense for the theory that Disserteau is working from. The storyteller is where it actually gets interesting. The storyteller is a strategist and a tactician when they're working within an organization, because they both act tactically with the organization itself and strategically with their players. So they can create home brewed rules. They decide when a rule doesn't make sense, or if they're going to run in a different way. Those are all strategic actions, but they also have to act tactically with all of the people in the organization to advocate for their players, to make sure their players are having a good time and can actually go through the world. And then the player is the tactician, subversion through play. So basically, for Diserto, tacticians are very much like, we don't like to be confined. Strategy is always confining us to certain types of behavior, and we are constantly trying to break out of that. So the player who is acting tactically against the world that is being created, or against the, against is a strong word, but against the storyteller or the organization or the rules could be like a power gamer who's like, no, I'm going to take this little rule that is doesn't actually mean anything and make it mean a whole lot so my character can be the best ever. And that's kind of like the bad example. The good example would be more like someone who really loves to play vampire but isn't super into the political game. And if they're in a game or there's only one game in their area, but that's a very political game, they can also act tactically to create space or plots or things for themselves that aren't about those politics, that are about more about the role play, more about bringing people together. And then it's also a tactical action that changes the world, the imagined world that they're playing in. So that's the power of the player. And so what I learned from this is essentially my hypothesis is right. We can take these theories that anthropologists have been using for a whole bunch of other types of governance to analyze Larp governance, and we can also use them to tell us about what this means. So, I'm skipping that because I don't have time. So the conclusion is basically, we can see how the player and the storyteller and the organization and the rules are all working together, but also in conflict. And there's always going to be conflict between power levels, because that's just the way humans work. But we can work to make sure that that's happening in a healthy way. So by just knowing that these power structures are in play and being able to analyze them, we can do something with that, which in my own thesis I didn't actually do anything with that. I was just like, hey, here's this thing. But that's the first step to kind of knowing what even to do with it. It gives us language, it helps us understand what's going on and process our own world. And the last 3 bullets of that are just basically, this was one region in Iowa, teeny tiny, 3 games, and we have a lot of different cultures just in one organization, in one World by Night, between Iowa and Chicago and New York. Like, there are vast differences in the way that people play, so we just need to do more of this work so we can understand more of what's happening. And there's my contact information.
Yeah, the other one.
And there's my contact information.
Murdock. I don't sit when I give presentations usually, so I may stand and like pace awkwardly. Perhaps it's a theatrical thing, but that's fine. But I'll try to sit for a moment as we begin this very serious discussion. So, the great thing about a conference like this is you get to hear all these presentations, get you super excited about role-playing. You're like, wow, that's great. This is some great new theory I can look at. It's just so exciting. And all I want to do is just go run and create a new Larp. And just like the whole world is at my feet. And then when you hear my presentation, it is not going to be one of those presentations. Mine is going to make you say, why would I ever want to run a Larp? Why would anyone else ever want to run a Larp? How does this exist still? How has this not stopped being in existence? We're going to explore that today together. So we're going to start with a few little cartoons. Just imagine they're talking about Larp here. Great little product, but the liability could eat you up. Sadly, that's true with Larp as well. So a few disclaimers before we begin. I'm an attorney, but I'm not your attorney. It's important to say, sometimes people misinterpret legal advice. As I gave you specific legal advice for your Larp, you should not say that you spoke to an attorney who told you this, and therefore you can be find that as some sort of defense. No, you should listen to what I have to say, but you're not my client. I don't even work for a law firm by which you could hire me, so it makes it even harder. I work for the government and doing something that has nothing to do with this, but I enjoy this, and I'm a lawyer. I went to law school, and I can study the law. And for an academic paper in the law, unlike maybe psychology or kind of a case study, what we do is we look at cases through whatever jurisdiction we decide to limit it. Here, because we have people from all over, mainly the United States, I'll get into this, why that's not quite as limiting as it sounds, but look at them all across the United States, not just Texas, not just Eastern United States, Western United States. So let's do the little overview. The main thesis or hypothesis, we don't really do that in legal academic papers, but LARP organizers unknowingly take significant legal liability upon themselves without realizing it. That's always a dangerous combination. So while the legal concerns faced by LARP organizers may seem novel, we're having wizards shoot fireballs at each other. There's no way, what could a judge or a court know about this or previous? When you kind of peel that away and you look at what a judge or a court would think about, you can find that it's not quite as unique as you think. Really, at the end of the day, it's a social gathering of people. Sometimes it's commercial. Sometimes you're trying to make money with your LARP. Sometimes you're not. Sometimes it's just friends getting together and playing a game. And it turns out that that is a very important distinction legally. And we'll get into that. Number one area that we're looking at here where things where you get in trouble is serving alcohol at a LARP or anything else. Most of the case law that comes up, most of the time you can really get yourself in trouble has to do with alcohol. The easiest way to skip 2/3 of this presentation is to just not serve alcohol at your events. But we're going to get a little more in detail than that. So in other areas, liability for actions and crimes committed by your staff or your volunteers. And just so we understand, liability, you wouldn't actually go to jail, we're saying, for hiring a staff who does something bad. It would be that they could sue you and ruin your life and make you declare bankruptcy and you lose your mortgage and lose your house and all of this, just because you thought it was a good idea to hire this guy who was a great role player. Finally, liability for personal injuries suffered. So watch out there. But who cares? Well, you got to take it seriously because you are going to risk legal and financial ruin. And I'm sure if any of you are not from the United States, you might be saying, well, in my country, people don't sue each other over everything. And maybe that's true. Maybe you're lucky. But you'll find that it's not quite so different where you live. And here's a note. If you run a for-profit commercial LARP, you should be very concerned about some of these issues, particularly alcohol. This is a very, very serious deal for you. If you don't run a for-profit LARP, you should still care about it, especially a few of the specific areas we'll talk on. So here's the lawyer fairy. And you can just imagine me. Anytime you're planning a LARP and making your big, grand guidance documents and just saying like all these great things are going to happen, just imagine me with wings flying in as you sleep at night. Play it safe. Play it safe. Yeah, we don't want this to come back and bite us in the you-know-where. Okay. So here we go. This is the promise part. Those of you who are from a country that you do not have permission to fall asleep just because you're not from the United States. What is this? You've heard about like cultural imperialism. There's also like legal imperialism. So you might think, oh, I'm from Sudan. We don't do any of this. Oh, wow. It looks like basically 2/3 of the world almost has a legal system based on two. All this red and these variations are English common law. What's the English common law? Best way to imagine it is it's a judge who would sit there and instead of statute, over the years, hundreds and hundreds of years, people come and say, this person came to my house and they tried to kill me, but I killed them first. And then the judge says, well, that makes sense. I mean, that's self-defense, kind of, and they come up with decisions about that. The United States, our whole law is based on that. Little did you know. So it's like that. And the big one that goes against that, if you're curious, Napoleonic law. One of the greatest things Napoleon left us with is the Napoleonic law, which is very big in Africa and France and other parts of Europe, in which we have seen that it's actually statutes. So this is like the people who kind of play it by gut with your safety or consent decisions. People play by gut, yeah, we're the English common law. But the people who write every little thing out, think Napoleonic law, Napoleonic code. Just depends how you want to go. But the point is, a lot of what I'm saying is based on English common law. If you're in Canada, Greenland, all these other countries, some of which I know the names of, some of which I don't. If you're in one of these, then you're faced with that. And if you're not, United States, England, they're pretty influential when it comes to things like the law and economics. Gotta watch out for that. Key points. Think very carefully before providing alcohol. Just going to keep saying it over and over again. LARP organizers can be found liable for the crimes of their volunteers and staff. It's crazy. I wouldn't have even thought of that, even though it's a pretty basic legal principle. The thought didn't enter my mind until I researched this. And LARP organizers owe a legal duty to their participants to protect them. It's be serious. But I know what you're thinking. I'm going to keep talking about it, but I know what you're thinking about alcohol. Who invited the buzzkill? You can thank Sarah Lynn Bowman.
It's always the case.
It's okay, let's talk about alcohol. For-profit LARPs, commercial hosts. I think we all get what that means. You're trying to make money by running a LARP. Even if it's not your full-time job, doesn't matter. If you're trying to make $500 a year, you're for-profit. You sell alcohol at face value. If you sell alcohol at a for-profit LARP, you are like flashing danger zone. You can do it. There's nothing wrong with doing that. However, you're going to face just stricter and stricter standard. Ultimately, in any of these cases, you're going to come before a judge and say, Judge, it's not fair for me to be liable for this. That's really what it comes down to. And then some have laws, some have case law, and the more for-profit you are, the more likely the judge is going to say, you should have known better. But even non-profit LARPs, even a group of 5 people who go and they do a freestyle LARP at somebody's house, they can get in trouble for giving alcohol away for free. So the exact opposite, you can still get in trouble. So I'd say don't serve alcohol. If you have to serve alcohol, never under any circumstances give it to someone who is drunk, or perhaps drunk, perhaps tipsy, had a few too many. Never ever give it to someone like that. And you know what? You say, well, I'm just a LARP, or I don't make much money, or it's just my friends. The court shouldn't find me liable. I'm not a rich person. Charities have been found liable and have had their money stripped away under this. It's not just going after Enron and British Petroleum. It's other people, the judges whose money you don't want to lose. So liability for crimes and actions of your staff and their volunteers. There's an example, a few of you heard this already. Basically, it comes down to, are you acting, or is your staff or volunteer acting within the scope of their staff doing or volunteer doing? So you'd say, oh, okay, so doing something I want them to do. No, it's not the standard. The standard is, does it seem like they're doing something that seems like in the scope of a volunteer? So there's an old case which is says if they're acting out of lust, it doesn't count, but that's from the 1800s, and that doesn't really seem to follow anymore. So really what we're looking at is, if you have a staffer, and your staffer, say, likes to trade XP for sexual favors, that's within the scope of it, so they can be sued. Say some 16-year-old is playing LARP, and her mom and dad find out that she's having sex with a member of your staff in exchange for favors, they can sue you. And if you knew that was happening, they can really sue you. So staff is worse. You might say, volunteer, I can't believe, wrong person's unpaid. It's still a similar standard, but admittedly, it's a little easier to get out of it with a volunteer. So again, you're a for-profit company that sells alcohol and you have paid staff, you need to take this very seriously. If there's a whiff of sexual impropriety about the person, I wouldn't serve alcohol at all. But if there's any whiff of it, you cannot afford to have this person on there. Because it's going to find out, tell me, Sarah Lynn Bowman, did you hear rumors that this person had ever had inappropriate sexual contact? Yeah, I've heard rumors about it before, but I didn't know. Oh, so you were aware. Well, I said I didn't know, you were aware. You brought a known predator onto your staff. That's what happens, because you're going to go and stand, and the defense attorney, or the plaintiff attorney, I guess in this case, is just going to rip into you. So you might want to think twice about who you allow to be staff. So, one other point, which I said this in the last one, but to really take home who and what is in the scope of your authority. Chef, juggling knives in the kitchen. If you own a restaurant, chef's juggling knives, somebody comes in, the chef drops it and it stabs a person in the chest, that's within the scope of their work. Even though you never would have wanted them to juggle knives, and you wouldn't even have wanted the person to go in the back room in the kitchen. It's still within the scope of it. So no broken stairs. Heaven's sake, no broken stairs. A broken stare, according to the article I read, which is very good, I think this person actually in attendance in the conference, was that, people who we all know, oh, this person's a great role player, but, except for the fact that they're always trying to sleep with everyone, or they're always trying to be a predator, or they're always trying to creep on people, or they always stare at the women weirdly, but, nothing's ever happened. Don't let these people be staff at your events. It sounds judgy. It sounds like, they've never been convicted of anything. I'm just telling you, don't let them be staff at your events. Especially if you've heard about something, it's just going to be bad. Key point here is the fact that the predator is an amazing role player is not a defense in court. The judge really doesn't care. Really doesn't. So you're on the hook for protecting participants from certain dangers. Shifting a bit. You got to exercise reasonable affirmative care to see that a site is safe. That means you rent an Airbnb, there's a little pothole there. You got to tell people about it. If you know it exists and someone gets hurt, you're liable. If you should have known it existed and you didn't know it existed, you're liable. So pay attention. Go around, look, and this is a super cement clear area of the law. You will lose this if you argue this. It's important that you look and you see and you pay attention. And just for fun, I thought this was an interesting question. Is it a defense in court that say well, sure, I touched this person inappropriately, but it wasn't me. It was my Tamitsi, vampire character, that's his thing. I was a Malkavian. I was a Malkavian. My madness was that I groped women. It wasn't my character. Does that work as a defense? No. The judge does not care that your Malkavian has this weird thing and that great role play has started from this derangement of your Malkavian. It doesn't matter. There's actually very disturbing cases on this. People have used role play to molest children and stuff, and so it was clearly done that does not hold court. So, let's conclusion. Larp organizers need to take their legal liability seriously, particularly for-profit. If you're a for-profit Larp organizer and you want to make a little extra money selling alcohol, I would just say don't do it. Especially don't give it to a minor. And if you're whatever a minor means in wherever you live, if you're just having fun, it's just Sarah and I having a Larp.
Like we did.
Like we did. And a 16-year-old, our 16-year-old friend comes, because we invite a 16-year-old over for some reason. And Sarah gives this person beer. And he drinks beer. And he drives off and crashes. Guess who's going down? Sarah's going down. It doesn't matter. Even if it's like a volunteer, it's like a big brother, little sister thing, and you're just trying to mentor this person. She wants nothing but to help this person. She's saving them from poverty, but she gives them beer. It's too bad. Sarah's going down. Sarah's losing her house. And me too, potentially, if I was involved. So don't do it. If you must give alcohol, do not give it to someone who's intoxicated, or looks like they're intoxicated. And in fact, I have a very strict rule about how many you give and watching that. So, also crimes and actions of your staff. You need to be very careful about this. Just don't put bad people on your staff. Don't let bad people volunteer for you either. And especially don't pay bad people to help be on your staff. It's not worth it. It doesn't matter how good they are, it's not worth it.
I'm going to nudge you because I'm also, you're out of time and I'm terrified. So, the last comment you want to wrap up with.
Yes, we do. So you also finally owe a legal duty to your participants to protect them from certain dangers, known dangers. Protect yourself. But there's further research needed. Of course, what I'm doing here is just telling you everything that's wrong. We need people to come and tell you a little more about affirmative steps you can do. Just a word of danger. Some people who know a little bit say, oh, I'll create a company and run it through the company. That helps, but there's a thing called piercing the corporate veil by which they can still come after you. So be very careful. And that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of players bringing alcohol to events, presuming that they're allowed on site, and how that affects the liability of an organizer.
It's a lot better that way. Really, like the more you separate it from selling and then giving, if you're not giving it, I'm not gonna say it's fine. It's still a little dangerous, but like it's nowhere near the same amount of liability. You'd probably be okay, but I mean, you do have all sorts of other issues, like people taking, like consent issues, people being intoxicated, etc. That I take really seriously. But just for classically drunk driving situation, you're probably okay. Cool.
I'm gonna circle through the whole room and let Alex and Brodie kick it off here.
People. Thank you.
Yeah, that's nice. This is a cute picture of us. It's way cuter on the laptop, I'm going to tell you right now. Let's just get toward a framework of Larp counseling. So, our overview. We're going to go over what Larp counseling is in a second, but the idea, the premise here is talking about developing a working framework for the activity that we're doing, which is essentially another layer in Larp safety and a service that we provide, as well as others. We're talking about psychology, a little game studies, a little bit of neuropsych. It's very the way it is. The theoretical orientation of this is very constructivist. There's a lot of existentialism, as well as there's going to be like 1 minute of Lacan. I swear to God, that's it. I'm gonna live with myself for like 1 minute, and then it'll be over. We're doing some original data collection that is ongoing, and this will not present on that. So first and foremost, the role of Larp counseling solves a great number of issues, and many dominant cultures of play remains controversial. We propose a transparent framework to regulate actions, mitigate fear, promote growth, so that the community may continue to benefit from its use. So we wrote a paper, that's why we should be here. This is only tangentially related. We're sorry. But this is very interesting nonetheless, and I'm sure you'll find it interesting as well. So we're breaking down in 3 parts. Defining goals, defining the praxis, and creating boundaries. Defining goals, where we assume you don't really know what a Larp counselor is, and we'll start from there. So the SQUO, or the status quo here, like basically we want to talk about what about the status quo necessitates this change and implementation of this role. Larp is hard.
Yeah, it's exhausting. You're gonna exhaust yourself.
It's kind of hard to do too, right? It's not something that people pick up very well and do. Sometimes they need guidance, and the best of us still need guidance in game from time to time. All right, Lacan. Larp is tantamount to Lacanian notion of drive in that it perpetuates a system designed to annihilate participation, and then it assumes another logic. This is a critique mostly of like the blockbuster paradigm, but essentially one is compelled to invest personal energy, like i.e. libido, based on the thanatic notion of escaping death, where they attempt to engage in cyclical ritual around an impossible goal, where they attempt to affect change and occasionally succeed, thus like adding inspiration for that libido, and complete the drive circuit, and then continue to exhaustion/termination. The blockbuster design consumes one's individualistic output and digests it within a vacuum, and then assumes the function of telling the organizer's planned story, which exists outside the realm of player output. I would take this like psychologically, or as like Descartes would, and I'll stand by that. Not so much like Lacanian like analytics. And then there are tools that we currently use, like out-of-game sanctuary spaces, which do work, and they are we're having a lot of success with those in the field. However, they are not perfect, right? While they halt regulatory resource depleting activities and replenish them, they are inaccessible in many ways, physically and psychically, because often you don't know that you need one, or to go get it. In fact, Larp is inherently something that distracts you from those needs. You're depleting your resources, you don't really you are not in the perfect mindset to address those your own personal needs. Do you wanna? This one's controversial.
Do you have to learn much?
Yeah.
Okay. So operating from here is that there are certain people who will take on attention, or take on ask for help in service of gaining attention for themselves outside of a system of satisfying what we might think of as like an actual dilemma or actual crisis, and we start to get into how to. I'm sorry, actually, am I right to speak?
No, that's fine. So basically, so LMS, as coined by like Lizzie Stark, was a tongue-in-cheek way of saying that, that enabled her to talk about this prevalence of participants consciously or unconsciously, fall victim falsely, to have claimed to have been previously harmed by the Larp in some capacity, or inflate their symptoms in order to gain attention / care, and that is like a thing that may or may not happen. Stark says it does. I would argue that it also does, but the difference is where Stark would say those people are like should not be given that attention. I would argue that they do, regardless of what their intent is. It's like consciously or unconsciously. And then of course there's Lori Brown's paper, who she concludes that players will always require emotional labor no matter what. That is like that is the status quo. That is probably now and forever. But the real question is whose responsibility is to deal with that. Is it an organizer? Is it a safety team? Is it a Larp counselor?
Other players?
Right, and that's something that there's people implement different solutions to with really mixed results.
So we propose that the Larp counselor is the person who would take on that emotional labor for a game. They occupy a diegetic and non-diegetic space in order to mitigate, resolve, and prevent issues on a variety of different axes. So the diegetic space means that they occupy a role within the fiction, so they have a space within the fiction in which they are collecting data on the game, using their authentic capacities as a LARPer. That then informs finding solutions for people who are coming with emotional labor needs later. They're also occupying non-diegetic spaces, such as physically the sanctuary space perhaps, but also operating largely in their non-diegetic capacity in order to unite players with play that they have been separated from through distress.
So a little bit about this. This came to Brodie through New World. It came to me through Sarah and Event Horizon. And then I think at this point we've done I've done 10 blockbusters collectively in fieldwork research on this subject. And it's gaining more and more attention. I think people are becoming more and more tolerant of implementing this sort of thing. So quick, I don't need to go through all these points. There's one very specifically that I want to go to, but if you look at them defined by activity and belief, beliefs are very important to us, hence the code of ethics that we wrote, because I think a LARP counselor TM in this case is a person with a certain belief system follows that code of conduct, which we will get to. But the important thing here is these beliefs that LARP is a psychological intervention in and of itself. So as a therapist implements interventions in which to cause changes in mental status, we do not do that. We believe that the LARP itself is an intervention, and we are there to help navigate that intervention. It is chaotic and mercurial and very powerful, and in many ways uncontrollable, but the intervention can be navigated in such a way that the harms can be mitigated or even beneficial if you are if you take care of yourself, talk to your LARP counselor. And these things are about, and then LARP epistemology is the cornerstone to navigating the intervention of the LARP. And we'll get a little bit more into that in a second.
We can look at recently Benedetto's framework of experiential risk to better understand what transformative aspects are present within a LARP and what participants are risking. and better understand that as, again, an inherently potentially transformative experience in which our role helps mitigate the undesired effects of that, or the out-of-control parts of that. Importantly also, combining that belief with proper action is the way in which we uphold this role, which we seek to define in this role.
Yeah. So defining a praxis where we avoid the operationalization of the character, person, observer, and favor pragmatism over psychological constructs. That was supposed to be funny, y'all. Anyways, basically, we don't want to get bogged down in the conversation about like what is a character? Do characters exist? What is the amalgam of character person? We are instead talking about, we're going to use existential therapy term called the observer. It's just the person, it's a vessel for input, essentially, and that is how we'll be characterizing a player character. We take on several approaches, but this framework uses an existential approach, or a humanistic one, which basically focuses on, well, we'll get into it. So just as any being's ontology is fluid and unstable, so is a player character's, or the observer.
You're using an academic word I love, but I'm not sure how well it's known. Can you explain ontology real quick?
It is, it's like basically the study of like being, right? It's something's existence to be. So it's like my ontology. You know, you can have personal ontologies, or you can study like ontology TM, which is like existing, of being, the act of being. Is that fair?
That works for me.
Okay.
Keep it short.
We got a lot of slides here. For negative personal experience, so we want, human beings naturally want to reify and rationalize their ontology as something that's not fluid, because fluidity in your ontology is very, very frightening. Yes, thank you. Existentialists believe that that is one of the causes of almost all personal distress. Because of that, because that is actually impossible, you can't like freeze your ontology in a fluid world. Psychological distress can be seen as the result of failing to cope with that fluidity, but feeling the need to. This is just like a 101 on existential psychology. I'm sorry, we're getting past this, but we interpret that distress via our interactions with several ecosystems. I'm so excited to present this.
Yeah. Watch out, go for it.
You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We just wanted to throw new words at you. This is the ecological systems of Larp that we've been developing.
Yes.
So this is based on Rothenbrenner's systems of ecology. It's a developmental model, but we've adapted it for our own uses. So if you're not familiar with Rothenbrenner's model, it essentially was, it stated that a child grows up in an environment and certain systems act upon it, ecological systems act upon it, whether that is their teacher, their mom, or like political systems, right? They all operate at different levels, and they all affect one another, creating unique systems of interaction and affection, and how they impact that child. So ultimately, this is describing layers of ecological systems of experience moment to moment, as opposed to the environmental impacts of development over a lifespan, as Rothenbrenner did. Thus, we posit that the observer is in a constant state where they're experiencing each system independently in intersection with which constructs their fluid phenomenology, as we just talked about in the previous slide.
So there's theoretical utility to this, but specifically for what we're talking about, with establishing a framework for counseling intervention, is that we can consider these the different sites of impact to consider when coming up with solutions to either do some psychoeducation about why a player is in distress, or in setting up a strategy of coping, considering how their current problem is presenting as influenced by these different systems, what they can influence, and the types of energy it would take for us in a counseling position to have influence over those.
We don't need to go into each one individually. We are short on time, but this will be available, and we're still working on developing it further. But it is based very closely on Rothenbrenner's I would point out that the mesosystem in this context is now the interaction of the diegetic system and the microsystem. That is, your other fellow players would be a great example of the microsystem in this case.
I'm gonna get a tattoo of it, so I'll be able to look at it. I'm gonna let you know we're at just about 15 minutes.
Oh my
However,
God.
However, we have this room until 3, and it is only 2:35. So, I'm pretty okay if you guys, you two go another 5 minutes
Is it
or
okay
so
5
longer.
minutes? I'm so sorry.
I came here to party.
Yeah, I think we're good for at least another 5 minutes.
Okay. So the term navigating the intervention we brought up earlier, which is the way of saying existing in a Larp and acknowledging its power and moving throughout. You were just talking, but this is essentially summarizing what Brodie was just saying about that, like, the purpose of those fields of ecology, in this sense, allow us to point to the ideology, the potential ideology of presenting concerns, and say, and illustrate how we might be the most useful. And in this case, we have 2 vectors that we prefer to use.
So yeah, again, that's either doing psychoeducation around distress or using helping skills, which are usually known as the basic counseling skills. The psychoeducation part is giving some context to what's happening with the player. So using usually Larp-derived theory to help explain what sort of dysfunction that they've found themselves within, so they then have the tools to cognitively reframe the problem that they're having, in addition to maybe some actual physical skills of taking time off the game. In other cases, that's usually though with someone, we talk about having a neuropsych component to that, and that's to say that in ways that we haven't defined, there is a cognitive toll on participation within a Larp, as we have probably all experienced. But one's ability to engage with helpful behavior for their self starts to change over their participation, and having the type of insight and awareness to combine some of that psychoed with their problem may be lost at a certain point within participation at a Larp. So we are either, again, helping talk people, contextualizing why things are happening to people, or giving them plans of action that we estimate, usually, and with their collaboration in a non-authoritative way, to cope with what's happening using our mastery to reunite them with a playful state. That could be some examples. That may be NPCing a game if they can't return as their player. That may be changing up some internal aspects of their player so they can re-engage with play. That may be connecting them with other players. That may be telling them they should probably go home and they're probably not going to have any more fun, so long as they're on the same page with that. Not sending someone home, but saying like, hey, let's be real about this. This is like you really miss your family right now.
Yeah. So that's the epistemological approach, and then there's like the helping skills approach, and sometimes it's a combination of both. But we find that out by locating the ideology on the fields of ecology. So this is where we wrote a paper about this part of the presentation, about where we very quickly talk about all the obvious need for regulation and standardization in a medium without any at all.
Okay, so the risk in doing this is that you have a lot of vulnerability in this spot, not only in what people are presenting to you, but also in your role being reified by the structure that you're within. Your players are told that a counselor is a safe person, in the same way that all of this Larp is a suggestion to being that they will treat it as a part of that reified structure. So you have people in vulnerable states sharing vulnerable information. And then there are a multitude of things that can go wrong where that information is shared. They give them bad advice, or someone may even take on, let's say, someone in crisis who is beyond their ability to help and make things worse for themselves and for the person who's come seeking help.
I think it's the bottom line here is the same thing with any sort of like intervention, right? Or any like helping is that like some people can help bad, and there's impacts to that. We don't need to. I don't think you can use your imagination for the sake of time. So we wrote a code of ethics. That's what this is about. So to mitigate these harms and allow people to feel comfortable utilizing this position, we wrote a pretty complex code of ethics.
Specifically, it says what people who are doing this role should be doing in order to perform it correctly, and what they will not do in order to define a limit both from the inside and from the out. So players know the extension of their capabilities, so that, for the sake of liability and expectation.
And I think the important part on this slide is that we are synthesizing ethical standards for a multitude of helping professions across many fields. The Code of Ethics, you will find similarities to a number of professions and meet and exceed, in many cases, those ethical standards.
Primarily also professional, like the ACA, Professional Code of Ethics.
Professional
Codes of ethics.
Yeah. And it contains, just very briefly, it contains 4 sections: professional conduct, relationship with players and organizers, and relationship with society, and then codes concerning diegetic interactions.
The codes concerning diegetic interactions is pretty much how you continue to participate in a playful way with the game that authentically unites a counselor with the state of play to gather data and also be at recreation within it in order to help take care of them. Thank you. And the ways that you generate that play, that again, still authentic but not typical of the type of dramatic arc you might have as a player.
Okay, we're still in the businesses. We're still figuring this out, right? Research is ongoing, and
I wrote those.
yeah, you want to do that?
Yeah. So we are still defining these things. The first part is gaining grounds to practice it. Also synthesizing information outside of what we might consider the small canon of literature, things that are authentically helpful and have been derived in other communities, and bringing those in. The first part is, again, removing some of the scary parts from it, or the superficial grounds in which someone might object to the role, to lay bare some of the more authentic places where people could find contention. We're still, again, another thing also is building discourse that can be refuted. Specifically putting ideas out there that other people can come along and disagree with, and through that synthesis build very more useful information, as well as developing a dialogue in tactics rather than asserting a monologue of best practice. And then building the ability to critique these ideas that we're setting out in our code of ethics and in our practice is the next step in continuing to improve player safety through this vector.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, sweet, we're all friendly now. I know I was taking notes for questions, so if I don't have time for my own, I can hunt them down later and ask exciting questions. But being moderator, I am a kind and forgiving God, and and we'll first reach out to the audience. Does anyone have a question for any of our wonderful panelists? Oh my goodness! So all the way in the back first, because your hand was first.
Actually came in the back, so I wouldn't be recognized. So I have questions for everybody, but I'm going to limit it to Brodie and Alex, because that's where I'm working at right now. So you have said that all Larp is intervention, and I think in that idea I'm concerned because intervention has two components, which is therapeutic intention and ethical responsibility. And although you're defining that code of ethics right now for that ontology as a Larp helper, a Larp counselor, people who have training and counseling skills are already bound by professional codes of ethics. So how are you, what is the plan for integrating those two kind of ethical codes together?
So and that's operating from that assumption that that it is an intervention. The system that we built it upon is a paraprofessional referral-based system. Therefore, because we're considering it non-counseling work, non-professional, non-therapeutic work, when it gets to a point in which we find some tension with those ethical standards, at that point, should someone be licensed and be performing the role, they're not being held to the standard of their licensure in doing that, and once it gets to that degree, we've instituted a referral system. Specifically, it's the Safer R system, which is a paraprofessional system, and we've also built into our code that it is ethical to, in maintaining this, to build a referral system before writing at an event, so that those conflicts do not come up.
Ultimately, I should be able to work. I operate under the ACE Code of Ethics as a graduate psych student, and I should be able to operate under both simultaneously without conflict. That is the goal.
So, Alex, I saw your hand next.
Yeah, I have a question. When you were talking about the Code of Ethics, one of the 4 domains was the counselor's relationship with society. And of all of the 4 of them, I was like, whoa, what does that mean? Can you expand on that at all?
Have you got it, Fresh?
Yeah. So I think that is a part about your responsibility to the LARP community and the greater community. That's about continuing to learn and contribute. We see the position as less of like a service, like a service you just provide, and an ongoing role that you embody. You must. It's required that people who are practicing this continue to contribute to the overall safety conversation, keep learning, and will also accept that they need to teach other people.
Yeah, to seek mentorship, to seek scrutiny, to provide that, and in doing so also in a larger way, the other side of society is in recognizing like multicultural competencies and biases within the person performing the role, and the not static but in process in scrutinizing their role, and then their like ideological biases in performing the role.
Cool. Steve?
Yeah. So there was a playful term, Larper's Munchausen syndrome, and Stark said you should not give people attention. Here's why. And you said you should give people attention. Here's why?
I think his a personal belief that that behavior is just another manifestation of a need, right? And regardless, they are going to require some service, some attention, right? Or however it manifests. And I would prefer that the LARP counselor do that thing than, even if it is needless, even if it is just like someone seeking attention, this is a person who can do that rather than that going to organizers or other players and fucking their experience.
I would just like to piggyback on that and say that Alex wrote a really awesome set of guidelines and boundaries for how to do emotional care. And it doesn't necessarily have to do with the situation, but it could be for a more serious situation as well. And it'll be part of our internal procedures, which you can find on our website. But there's a certain point where if you're giving too much, regardless of the type of care, it can actually probably do more damage than good. So learning how to transition that person into, like as you mentioned, some other therapeutic intervention is also important. So I just wanted to
and I
mention
think
that.
the perception that that like attention-seeking behaviors should be ignored rather than attended to comes from the real lived experience of giving the wrong kind of care in response to a behavior, or giving a sort of never-ending well of self-serving care, like I'm going to respond to you in a way that makes me feel good, rather than responding in a way that is like genuinely helpful to the behaviors. So I totally see where people are coming from, but.
Sorry, so this Alex wrote that.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
I'm very
Sorry.
confused because I'm like,
Sorry, yeah, I know.
I would just also say that it is, you're on a slippery slope once you start being like, nah, you're faking it, like you just want attention, right? Like overlook one thing and that could be really, really, really serious consequences.
A key part of the answer you gave spoke to my concerns actually was you're talking about having a LARP counselor do this in part because then it's not the organizer doing it. And I think like Stark was not talking about having a LARP counselor. It was more like you can't as an organizer spend all your attention on the two attention seekers. Having another person to address it makes it a lot more addressable.
I believe that Stark wrote that before there was such a thing as a LARP counselor.
Yes.
I would consider that emergent from that discourse.
Absolutely.
There's a person behind Steve. Sadly, I do not know you. My name is Jason. Did I see you? What's your name? Jen. Nice to meet you. I know there's another question. I want to actually, I am going to temporarily hijack it to talk about a little bit of a point of intersection between these, because I feel like there's, both in terms of analyzing the organization and in terms of counseling, you know, there's always going to be an intersection with legality. And one of the things I'm thinking about is people who are serving roles similar to LARP counselors because they occupy positions of authority. And even though it's a diegetic, when you take people as having power, pretend power becomes real power, pretend responsibility becomes real responsibility.
Much
So,
power is pretend.
yeah, that is, and you want to talk Foucault with me?
That might just be intent, actually.
But I'm bringing it up specifically because I'm thinking about the intersection between the presenters here in terms of the kind of role that they occupy within an organization, in terms of legal responsibility, but also in terms of the flow of power as you're discussing, and also in terms of tactics and strategies, because they end up being both a tactician and a strategist as an interlocutor. But they are often not trained. I myself have served that purpose. I am an educator, so I have some amount of training. I would probably recognize if it was beyond my ability and set it up, although not necessarily. But I was wondering if anyone wants to talk about that role of the diegetic authority figure and how that intersects with your presentations. Or not.
I mean, I'd just say quickly, just simply, the law definitely acknowledges certain people are in positions of authority and you're supposed to act accordingly. And I mean, and it's easy, there's more stuff talking about, you know, there's a hole in the ground or something you knew about, but I think as it goes to issues more like what we're talking about here, I think as an organizer, this is sort of in the, you know, the final frontier of legal liability, but I think if you are aware of issues and you just do nothing about it after telling people that you have a system in place, or if you just ignore their concerns, it's dangerous. I mean, it's hard to say how a court will come out on that, but you're right. Especially as you set up these systems, you do have the duty, ethically and maybe legally too.
I'm especially thinking about your hiring them because they're a good role player.
Yeah.
And that is especially dangerous if you consider them as both tactician and strategist, because then you can't have the problem with this very talented person subverting the structures that they're supposed to be enforcing for reasons that are not great.
I mean, what I would say is kind of like twofold. There's both like a positive and negative to having someone that you give power as a counselor in that space, and that is these people already exist. We all know them. They're the people in LARP that everyone knows because they come to every single one, and you know that you can divulge information to them, and you know that they are there for you. And often they end up getting overused because they often don't have training, or don't know when they've done too much, or don't know when they are in deeper waters than they anticipated they were going to be. And so giving someone that power there's an outlet for that, and then someone like the ability to say, hey, we're going to get all these counselors together and go do a training, and there's more ability to make that that community more healthy. On the other side, when you kind of make more bureaucracy, essentially, there's always the potential that that's not going to work out in your favor. People who don't like authority figures, people who take on too much power when they're given that power as a counselor, because you're right, it does kind of like go in between. Like you give them power, and so they get power both in the community as people and also as players, and how that all works. Could become treacherous, but if these people already exist, we should be supporting them. So, I don't know.
You guys, did you two have anything else to add to that, or?
That we have like the fourth section of the Code of Ethics is on how to negotiate that relationship in which the system of reality making within it inherently adds to your social status, and how to work against that by avoiding certain plot lines, certain ways of characterizing oneself within the diegetic role, and then offering drawing restrictions out of games, saying that it is like, especially around relationships. And the next thing in defining this is also getting a more nuanced understanding of what it means to have a power differential. The difference between like, if you have a standard that says like no sexual contact, just take that, like the difference between like your partner arriving at the game with you, and going through a game and then ending, versus like someone that you meet there and they get an impression of you from a position of power, and then the event ends, the formal event, and the code of ethics for that event ends, but after the event, the impression of power differential is still present in that dynamic. That's where we are.
Lovely bit of complication. I'm going to try and remember, your name's Paul, right?
Yes.
See, 2 points for me. All right, Paul, I know you have your hand up, and then Sarah.
Okay, my question specifically for Russell, and it's kind of regarding that domain of like should have known, and maybe the liability that an organizer or designer takes on when they include a system, like I'm going to have a counselor, and versus like not having the counselor, even though you know that there's a possibility of harm in place, or not having that system in place. Are you accept the liability of any harm that might be caused by the counselor? And is it worse than not having the system in place and not addressing that liability concern?
I would say, especially as LARP counselors become more normalized, you may actually face the issue where if you don't have a LARP counselor and something bad happens, the judge could say, see, this one...
Tell your friends.
Yeah, this one does it, and therefore you should, especially as a corporate, obviously anything is more stringent if you're a for-profit, big-time LARP. As far as... The other element of the question was whether you just should have known, as if like not having a LARP counselor could help you because you're just not aware of the issue.
Right, yeah, like I didn't have a counselor because it wasn't known to me.
Like the fact that this presentation exists, does that constitute, oh, well, you are in the field, you should be aware of all these things?
Oh my God.
Not yet.
I mean, probably not, but as the field continues to advance, I think, and as it becomes more normalized that we care and it's no longer the Wild West on these issues, I think the standard would probably continue to get more stringent. I don't usually, putting your hands over your eyes is not a good legal defense. It's about any context. I think the one narrow area where what you're saying I think could be an issue though is if, say, something happened you wouldn't have known about otherwise, and then a counselor brings it to you and you ignore it, then you'd probably be in a worse place for having had a counselor. But I mean, I think the idea is when the counselor brings it to you, you would take it seriously. That's probably the only situation I could think of, because it should have known. So if there's some strange thing and it's a little situation you don't have a counselor, so there's no way you would have known. I don't think that would drag you.
Can I ask a follow-up on that question?
If you could be super fast, we're at 2:58, but
Oh.
Right, so LARP counselors,
so we'll make time for standards.
safety policies, not very new, fairly prevalent. Do you think there'd be a liability for an organization that does not have any kind of a safety policy or code of conduct?
I mean, it's okay. So just to be specific here on liability, it's not like you couldn't get sued just because you didn't have a safety thing.
Right.
However, if something bad happened and you're there saying, "I did everything I could," it's just one of those things. It's not like that alone would hurt it, but I think a judge would say, "You're this large LARP. You've been organized for 20 years. You make X amount of dollars per year. These safety guidelines have been out for 10 years," and their attorney is going to say, "New World Magiscola has all the safety guidelines. This was brought to their attention, and they continue to ignore it because they just believe in a good old boy system or blah, 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 blah." And it's just an argument. It's not like it would win or lose it on its own, but it's certainly a bad argument to have against you.
All right, I want to grab Sarah's question as our last question. If you have more, certainly I'm sure all of our panelists will be available.
Yes, it's really just more of a comment about how much I'm loving the intersection of these three things and really talking about the LARP structures and the governance and what responsibility those people have. And, kind of following up on what Russell was just talking about, like my experience in trying to talk about safety to LARP to very well-meaning and people that I love, LARP organizers, is that response of this is the way things have always worked, and actually if we were to implement those things then it would make us more liable. because then we are acknowledging that we are doing a psychologically dangerous activity, and we would have to pay more in, you know, fees and this and that for insurance and yada yada yada. So it's this tension, right? It's like some people, you know, don't want. It's like this is the amount that we are saying that we are potentially creating a risky environment. I prefer the term risk to danger. Whereas, as opposed to, hey, let's create some structures that could potentially mitigate some of these risks, you know, and optimize the social environment. So it's complicated, and I just really am very appreciative of all of you.
I have a lot to say as an imaginary ethics professor.